with me. Hopefully that will be enough to get me through. Okay, right, and the recording has started, so let's start the lesson. So today we will be talking about CSS some more. We'll be continuing and kind of building on where we left off last time, which for anybody who was with us for the previous lesson will know that we covered some of the kind of fundamentals of CSS. Today, what I would like us to do is, well, go further with that. So the main things that we'll be looking at today are CSS layouts and kind of layout techniques. And then we'll also spend a bit of time looking at responsive web design. So these are two critical parts of design and CSS. And I've just taken my first sip of water for the day. So CSS layouts. Let's look at this first. Now, creating CSS layouts can be difficult, but it doesn't have to be. So what I'd like us to just do first is kind of just go on a little bit of a journey and do a brief history of CSS layouts and the techniques that were used over the years. I just want to make sure I can still see the chat at the same time because I don't want to miss anything crucial. So hopefully I can still see that on my screen. Anyway, so a brief history. So in the beginning, there was, or better yet, there still is a HTML element known as table, which was great for building tables. But as website layouts became increasingly complicated, the table element soon ended up becoming the kind of go-to method for building page layouts. And really, it's kind of, how did this method become so common? But if we take a look at the kind of typical page structure of a website, it's not hard to see similarities between a table or kind of like a spreadsheet even. If you think, if you have like a small spreadsheet in Excel or Google Sheets or whatever, if you were to try and use those cells, you could probably design a layout on those cells. And it effectively became a case of that's what people were doing with the table element. But as websites became more sophisticated, this approach became not only hard to understand and manage, but we ended up, because we ended up using tables inside of tables, inside of tables, inside of tables, and so on. And in addition, as the kind of mobile web became prominent, the need to make responsive websites meant that things such as tables just were no longer useful for that purpose. And really, tables nowadays or the table element should only really be used for creating tables. Although, kind of bearing this in mind, it can be kind of pleasantly nostalgic to take a look at some older websites and look at the code, and you can kind of see that, they've used these tables and things like that. Interestingly, I noticed a few people had used tables in their most recent homework. That may potentially be because you just wanted to use a table, but I'd be curious to know whether some people were using tables as a layout technique rather than simply just for creating a table on their website. By the way, as well, when we look at tables, or when we're talking about tables and use for layouts, we're referring to kind of the mid to late 90s, so a very long time ago. After that, more recently, floats became something that was used. Now, the approach for the float property was used typically in combination with other things as well. Float is kind of a positional technique that was used. And when it became common for people to use floats instead of tables, you could pretty much see a lot of people just using them. But it was, to kind of, if you think of float as what you're kind of saying is, okay, I want this block of these elements to float to the left-hand side of the web page or to the right-hand side of the web page. And doing so in this fashion was quite hacky. It wasn't really a sustainable way to kind of create websites. Nowadays, you shouldn't really be using floats to do layouts. You should only really need them in very specific scenarios, and so specific that I've never had to use them in any of the websites I've ever created. So floats as a layout technique have been kind of confined to the history books, so to speak. More recently, or basically from 2012, the introduction of display flex or flexbox or flexible box model or module, many different words that you may have heard before. But anyway, in 2012, this became part of the CSS spec and was a real step forward. It solved many existing layout problems, and it made web developers and designers a little bit happier because it made their work a lot easier and intuitive. Now, for page layouts, that can be defined with Flex primarily in terms of either columns or rows. For instance, if you wanted to align 3 boxes in a single row, using Flex would give you an easy way to be able to do this. Moving on, more recently as well, within kind of the past 5 years, there has been a new thing added to the CSS spec known as grid. And this sort of layout enables you to be able to create layouts in 2 dimensions, so both horizontally and vertically. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that Flex allows you to do that as well, but there is a little bit of a difference. So while Flex gives you full control over making layouts either in columns or rows, grid allows you to do both at the same time. So you could kind of think as Flex as allowing you to create layouts in 1 dimension, whereas grids allow you to do that in 2 dimensions. So with that in mind, does it mean that nowadays we should just use grid for everything? Well, the answer is no. So while I would suggest staying away from tables and floats, Flex and grid serve different purposes and are both very useful. So Flex and grid also work well together. So you could put a Flex element within a grid element or vice versa. The important thing to decide in each case is which layout system is best suited for the layout that you're trying to create. A common approach here is to maybe use grid for the full page layout, so kind of like the outer container, and then use Flex for everything else, so the kind of inner components. This, is a good rule of thumb. However, it's also possible and sometimes the right approach to just use grid for building those components as well. So before you start developing, the first step should perhaps be to consider whether the component you plan to build is 1-dimensional or 2-dimensional. So just going to take a sip of water. And is everybody okay so far? Can you all hear me? And is everyone following? Okay, awesome. So sounds good. Okay, so we've got an idea of the kind of history of layouts now. So let's take a look at Flex. So the flexible box module, as I mentioned, is usually referred to as Flex or Flexbox, was designed as a 1-dimensional model. And as a method that could offer space distribution between items in an interface. So that might sound a little bit confusing for some people. Don't worry. Just treat it as me using big words for no reason. So when we describe Flex or Flexbox as being 1-dimensional, what we mean is that we're just describing the fact that Flexbox deals with layout in 1 dimension at a time. So either as a row or as a column. When for people who have used Flex before, you'll know that you can still make things in columns and rows, but the thing is you are doing them separately, even though it might not feel like you are in the moment. It'll make a bit more sense as you start to kind of use Flex and use Grid, and you'll start to see the differences. So when working with Flexbox, you need to think in terms of two axes. So there's the main axis and the cross axis. So the main axis is defined as the flex direction property, and the cross axis runs perpendicular to it. So everything we do with Flexbox refers back to these axes. So it's worth understanding how they work. So let me just make sure I've not gone too far ahead. No, here we go. Okay, so yeah, so the main axis is defined by flex direction, and flex direction has 4 possible values, which you can see on the screen at the moment. So we've got row, row reverse, column, and column reverse. Okay, so should you choose row or row reverse, then your main axis will run along the row in the horizontal direction. So this would be the main axis in this case. It's the direction that we are telling our components or elements to go. When you hear the horizontal direction or the row direction, in this case, we can also think of this as the inline direction. The reason why I wanted to point this out is because, as you might remember from our HTML lesson, I believe a couple of weeks ago, we spent a bit of time talking about block elements and inline elements. And you'll remember that block elements fill up the entire width of the screen. So if you have 2 block elements, they will be on top of each other. In other words, they'll be going vertically. Whereas if you have inline elements and you have 2 of them, they will be side by side in a horizontal fashion. So we can think of the horizontal direction as the inline direction. So if you choose column or column reverse for your flex direction, then the main axis will run from the top of the page to the bottom. So it'll be vertical, or it will run in a block direction. So I hope that makes some sense, because I know it might sound a little bit confusing when you think about the fact that last week we were kind of just talking about colors and sizes, and now it might feel as if we're talking almost with kind of bits of geometry and things like that. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's just see. Okay, so we've got some people wanting to know questions. What I would suggest, Hafiz and anyone else, just either remember the question or just write it, and I'll come back to them at the end, because it will just help to make sure that the lesson still flows at a kind of a proper pace. Because I know, Hafiz, if you ask a question, then 5 more people may potentially ask a question, and then the next thing we know, we're answering questions for 20 minutes. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so so we know about flex directions. Let's just go back to this one for a moment. Okay, so just one thing I wanted to add as well. Adding flex direction to the flex container allows you to change the direction in which the flex items display as well. So if you, for example, used row reverse, which you can kind of see here, row reverse and column reverse, it's going to keep the items in a row, but it's going to flip the direction of those. So if you imagine you had these 3 boxes here that say A, B, C, if you reversed it by using, say, row reverse, then it would be C, B, A. So C would be in position 1, B would still be in position 2, but A would be in position 3. So you can quite easily just reverse things by just sticking reverse on the end. Now, while Flexbox is a one-dimensional model, it is possible to actually make flex items wrap around onto multiple lines. And in doing so, you should consider each line as a new flex container. But any space distribution will just happen across that line without reference to the lines on either side. So if that didn't make any sense, if we used something like flex wrap and we used wrap, if we have a look at, say, this, you could imagine that if, say we've got this remaining space on the right-hand side, if you started to just decrease the width, eventually it'll get to the point where the dotted line is going to hit the C. If you kept going, then what would happen is if you've got wrap, C will just drop down onto a new line. So it would effectively appear below A. Whereas if you used no wrap, then that's not going to happen. So even if you were reducing the width of the screen, the items would just still stay on one line, which would probably create quite a weird looking design. Now you can actually combine properties as well. I mean, there was something we wanted to talk about last week, but we kind of ran out of time, and that was CSS shorthands. So I did recommend that you have a look into those. So some of you will know that there are things that you can just reduce down to one line of CSS instead of writing 3 or 4 or 5. And flex direction and flex wrap are one of those. So you can combine them into just the flex flow shorthand, where the first value is for the flex direction and the second value is for the flex wrap. So you'll see here we've got flex flow row wrap. I imagine some of you could actually think of some suggestions for what else we could put there. Some of you may already know some. For example, we could put flex flow, column reverse, no wrap, and that would work. And hopefully you kind of understand what that would do based on, you know, what we've just mentioned before. Okay, right. So there are a few things here that I know we haven't discussed just yet, but if you're making flexible CSS or flexible layouts, this might be an example of kind of everything you need to make the flexible layout that you're looking for. So you'll see here that if we did something like this, content's going to be presented horizontally. I know some of you might be wondering, what does justify content align items do and flex? That's okay. We will cover those as well. If we did something like this, where it's flex flow and we have row wrap, before we had row no wrap. If we do flow wrap, then row wrap, then that means content is allowed to kind of go onto an additional line, but it will still be going from left to right. Exactly, D. Yep, that's a really good example as well. So that's one that I will use a lot as well with border. For anybody who's watching this after the fact, I just wanted to point out that D gave a good example in our chat of a CSS shorthand. A lot of people, if they're making borders on elements, typically you might put something like border colon and then maybe 1 pixel solid red, for example, to make a 1 pixel border around it. Whereas that's actually shorthand for doing border size, border style, and border color. Okay, so just to show you a couple other ones, we've got column no wrap, which would present content vertically, which is kind of what we're used to really when you're not using layouts. Or you could do column wrap, and then that's going to make content wrap onto new lines. Okay, so one thing that we can do as well is when we use flex, it allows us to have more control over the individual items inside of it. And when I say items, I mean the individual kind of HTML elements inside of our container, which would probably have, display flex on it. And we can do this with 3 properties as well. So we've got flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. Now, before we can make sense of these properties, we need to consider the concept of available space. And what are we doing when we change the value of these flex properties? Well, what it does is change the way that the available space is distributed amongst our items. So let me just see. Okay, yeah, great. So I've got this example here that I wanted to show you. So now if we had this, if we had 3 100 pixel wide items in a container that is, say, 500 pixels wide, if we don't do anything with kind of flex, grow, shrink, or basis or anything, or even distribution, that's just how the items might appear on the left-hand side, which would leave 200 pixels of available space on the right. But what we can do is use some of the flex properties to distribute these items. So in other words, it might be that we want to spread these evenly across those 500 pixels. So maybe it's, so you've got A where it is on the left, but maybe we want B to be right in the middle, and then we want C to be right on the right-hand side where we've got some kind of space in between each element, as an example of what you could do. This is what we can kind of use those flex properties for as well. Now, the thing is, you'll very rarely see flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis properties used individually. Instead, they tend to get combined into one, which is with the flex shorthand, very similar to, say, Dee's example of how we would use the border shorthand to make those 3 properties that we discussed. So the flex shorthand allows you to set the free values in the order of flex grow, flex shrink, flex basis. Now, to get a better understanding of this, because I know I haven't really discussed too much about what kind of numbers you can put in, I'm going to give you a link to a website at the end. Oh, actually, these are some interesting ones that Dee's put on here as well. These are actually different, I think, to the ones that I've got, so I'll have to check those out. But ultimately, these are kind of like these little playgrounds or kind of layout generators where you can just quickly input some values and it will show you what it would look like. So with Flex, this is pretty much all of the properties available or related to Flex. Now, I know that might seem like loads. It's really not that many. It's just a case of some of them have a lot of different options. But if you think about it, if we were saying, if we look at, say, justify content, you can see there's about 8 or 9 or 10 different values there that you could give to it. It might seem like a lot, but if you're looking at, say, a measurement of something, so say if you're setting the width of a property, that has an infinite amount of values that you could give to it because it takes a number. So really, things like justify content don't have that many values, and most of the time there's only maybe 2 or 3 of them that you'll actually use. But I just put that there so you're aware. Okay, so I just wanted to show you a little bit of a layout, and then don't worry, we'll actually look at some code in a moment. So where could something like Flex be useful? Well, let's imagine that we've got this container. Maybe we've got some content in there. Maybe then we've got a bunch of text as well. Now, if you were creating this without Flex, that's just how the content would lay out anyway. You wouldn't need to use anything for that. But then as soon as we say put display Flex on the container, it changes from this to that without us having to do anything else. Like that, just literally that will change it to that. Then we could theoretically maybe do the same for the content section, and it would change it to that. So just with those lines, it changes your website layout from that to that. Okay, well, anyway, time for a demonstration. So you'll see my face again for a moment, I think. Hello, everyone. So let me just get the screen ready. Hey, Hafiz. How is everybody doing so far as well? Like, is this making sense to some people? And kind of, is it making complete sense? Is there a little bit that you're confused about? Awesome. Okay, that's good. Okay. Right, just bear with me one moment whilst I get the code. Because any good teacher prepares things in advance. Right, so let me just actually find my VS Code file. Here we go. Okay. Right, so let's start with an empty screen, and then let's reshare this. I agree, Ibrahim. Some examples would be good. Devesh, you scared me for a moment then when you. So for anyone watching this afterwards, Devesh just said in the chat, "You're not a good teacher," and then I was a little bit worried, but then he's just followed it up with "You're the best." So that's really kind of you to say as well. That's throwing me off a little bit. Okay, right. Let me find the screen I want to share. Here it is. Go with the flow of Flex. I agree, Raji. I agree. Devesh, you did it on purpose as well. You're so cheeky. But I appreciate it. Right, so, okay. Right, so here is some HTML. Right, cool. So you can all see it. That's good. Okay, so, it looks pretty boring at the moment, of course. And please bear with me in the sense of I'm not going to show you some amazing CSS layouts because that's not the purpose of this. Further down the line when we start to do some, say, design classes, then we'll definitely, be making more interesting things. But for now, I just want you to understand the concepts of Flex a bit better. So let's just paste in some basic code. Or again, this hasn't got any flex on it. Okay, so that's just how it would appear. And all I've done is just put some margins and padding and some background colors on each item. So kind of just trying to make it look like what you saw in the presentation a moment ago. Okay, so how do we start to turn this into something that uses Flex? Well, we could go to our container. If you bear in mind that the container is the outermost thing, okay? So it's the kind of purple, the little purple thing on the outside. And if we put display Flex on there and save it, you'll see that all of a sudden the content just kind of splits into two and runs horizontally. Maybe we could do the same on the content as well. Now the content, by the way, is the big pink section, okay? If we put display Flex on that, then it just makes them go like that. So bear in mind that we haven't set any direction on this or anything. All we've done is put display Flex on it. So you can think of this as the default being, okay, well, when I'm not using display Flex, everything kind of runs as a block from top to bottom. But if you put display Flex on it, all of a sudden everything becomes inline, where it runs horizontally from left to right. So bear that in mind. Okay, well, what if we didn't actually want everything to run from left to right? Well, as we know, we could use flex direction, or better yet, we could use the shorthand, flex flow. And let's just put column on there. And it kind of brings it back to this. And you'll notice as well that even though we're using the shorthand, flex flow, we didn't actually need to put column wrap or column no wrap. It still just works without it. So don't feel like you have to put everything in there. Sometimes it's a case of after the first value, the rest are just optional. Okay, so maybe let's put display Flex on the text as well. In fact, we don't even really need it there. Let's put text align center. And then all of a sudden we've got this. So, not a beautiful design by any means, but hopefully it demonstrates again what you can do with Flex. So let's take a look at another example. So let's get rid of all our text and think. Let's imagine now that we've got a bit more going on. So again, this doesn't look like anything at the moment, but let's take a look at the HTML, and you can see some of the semantics that we've got in here, or semantic HTML, which hopefully you're all kind of getting a bit more used to now. So we've got nav. You'll see here I've actually got a div class of container. Not the end of the world, because as mentioned to you guys and girls and everyone, that it's okay if you're using them if you've not got any other options available. You'll see here we've still got a main class here, and we've still got sections and things like that. We've actually also got an aside as well. So we're trying to create a sidebar, and we've got a footer. So we've got quite a few things going on here. But of course, our layout, or what you can see in the actual UI, doesn't really look like that. So let's just put a few things on here as well. Okay, so it's starting to look a bit more like a layout, but our sidebar is kind of just sandwiched between our footer and the kind of content area. One thing I would just point out as well is you'll see here on the main class, we've got this width 70, and we've also got somewhere, it should be a width 30 on the aside. Where is it? Oh, there it is. I couldn't see it because it kind of wrapped over onto the new line. But yeah, so we've got width 30 here as well. Now, these aren't really doing anything special. Some of you probably can just guess what they're doing anyway. You'll see in the CSS, it's just width 70 of doing 70, and then width 30 doing 30. So I just want to see this question from Ibrahim. Is it good practice to use main instead of div when creating the container tag? Well, yes. I mean, generally, it's but it's just a case of it's the main content for the page. So it's just the main section, but you should only have one of them. So you might typically see it as being a container. In this case, we're using it slightly differently here. But you're right. You know, we could very well switch these around. That could actually be main, and that could be div. The only reason I've not done it in this case is because if you're making a main, if you have a main element and you use something like an aside to create the sidebar, as we're doing here, aside should not be inside of main. It should be separate to it. So we've had to use div. A div tag for the container in order to make this layout work. But no, it's a good question. And yeah, anyway, so we've got this layout. So how do we actually make it look a bit more like what we envision? So let's first tackle the navigation, because that navigation looks a bit crap at the moment. It's just all of the information's on the left-hand side, and that's maybe not necessarily what we want. So as you will know, we can do display flex. And then we can start to use one of these ones that we haven't really discussed too much. And the reason is because, well, I want you to figure this out eventually. But we could do something like space around. And the thing I like about these names is they're quite literal. You know, maybe justify content doesn't make too much sense at the moment, but space around, we're just saying, okay, I want you to put some space around whatever's inside of this container. In this case, navigation. So that immediately just spreads the content across it. Okay, let's go to our container and maybe let's do display flex. Okay, so it's starting to push things out there, but it looks a bit strange. So let's do flex flow row wrap. Okay, starting to look a bit more like how we envisioned it would. So we won't do any more for the style. Of course, you know, the UI is terrible, but it's actually showing you how to do the layout for these things. You might be wondering, why did the footer wrap over, but not the other bits? And that's because of the width 70 and width 30 that we had before, of course. So the the kind of pink section is width 70, and then the sidebar on the right is width 30, which of course creates 100%. So then anything additional to that, in this case the footer, just wraps over onto to below it. Okay, so there were a couple of examples. Hopefully that kind of gives you a bit of an understanding of how easy it is to use, really. All we did was, we had everything set up beforehand. And that's the thing, as long as you kind of prepare for it properly and think in advance how you want the layout to look, it can be quite easy to just, put display flex on and things will just work. So let's come out of that screen for the moment. We will come back to that in a bit, though, so don't worry. There is more code to see. In the meantime, you can see my face. And then let's come back to the presentation. Okay. So time for a presentation. Well, no, we've just done that. Okay, so where am I? Okay, well, this layout is actually just the one I showed you a moment ago. So I probably should have come back to this, but never mind. So how do we make this layout? Well, we showed you, so that's cool. And we've done that demonstration. So, and just to kind of wrap up what we saw a moment ago, this is pretty much everything we had. We had a container. Of course, we had a navigation as well, but let's just ignore that. The main things that actually made the layout work were the container, the content, and having the width 70 and 30. They were the things that allowed us to do that. Okay, so that's kind of everything I wanted to cover for CSS for Flex for now. Okay, so as mentioned, there are other parts to Flex that are important, such as justify content, align items, align content, things like that. It's worth looking into those. So what I'm going to do is at the end, I will give you some additional kind of further reading that I suggest you have a look into just to get a better understanding of it. But let's move on and have a look at grid. So, okay, so like tables, grid layouts enable you to kind of align elements in columns and rows, which allows you to do two-dimensional layouts within a container element. So a grid, well, basically, yes, it allows you to do things like this, which you could do with Flex, and you can, well, better yet, you can do with Flex, but grid can make it, well, it can make it a little bit easier in some ways. So when we say grid, what do we mean by that? Well, a grid is a set of intersecting horizontal and vertical lines, okay, that define columns and rows. So elements can be placed onto the grid within those columns, those column and row lines. So to create a grid container, just like how we did display flex before, we just, in this case, we do display grid on the element. And as soon as we do this, all child elements become grid items. So all of the direct children are now grid items. In a web browser, you won't see any difference to how these items are displayed before turning them into a grid, as the grid will just create a single column grid for the items. Right, okay, so here we go. Yeah, so so when you create a grid with when you create a grid with fixed track sizes using pixels, for example, it creates the grid to a specified pixel which fits to the layout you desire. By the way, those lines you can see, that's effectively when you do display grid, it starts to create something like that. Of course, the actual sizes of the elements is something that we would change eventually. Right, I'm just going to stop looking at the chat for a moment because it puts me off a little bit. So, okay, so where was I? Yeah, so when you create a grid with fixed track sizes, and by fixed track sizes, we're referring to things like pixels. You can kind of do specified pixel widths for each component, for each element inside of the container. Or you can also use some kind of specific sizes for grids. So you can use things like percentages as well, or you can use this new kind of FR unit, which is designed for this purpose. And FR just basically means kind of, it just means fraction. So in this case, if you can imagine that let's imagine that this is kind of like we've split our page into 4 columns, each being 25%, or a fraction of 100, or fraction of 4, I guess, then we're saying, okay, we want those 2 bottom lines to take up the entire space. So we want them to be 4 fractions. Well, what's half of that? 2. And then what's half of that? 1. So hopefully that kind of makes a bit of sense. I know it sounds a little bit confusing. If you don't want to use fractions, that's okay. You can just use percentages instead, which probably makes a bit more sense now to you, hopefully. So when we define rows and columns on our grid, we typically use something known as grid template columns and grid template row properties, and these define grid tracks. Now, grid track is the space between any 2 lines on the grid. So if you think of it as these, it's the spaces between each line, each track. So for example, if we look at the bottom where we've got 100%, and we've got these dashed lines going all the way around it, they're track lines, which are typically what we would refer to. So another way to look at this is, although we've got 5 rows, we've actually got 6 horizontal track lines. And they're typically what you can sometimes use when you are doing the layouts with grid. Might sound a bit confusing again, I know. It's one of those things where you just have to practice using it, and it will start to make more sense kind of the more you experiment with it. Okay, so we've got this example on the screen, which is actually the same example that we used in Flex. So how would we create the same thing with grid? Well, it's time for a demonstration. So let's switch the screen and you'll see my face again. Hello, everyone. And let's go to our code. Okay, right, so this is the code from before. So let's just get rid of everything. Make sure we're starting fresh. Okay, right, there's our HTML. And here's our CSS. Okay, so let's have a look at the navigation first. Okay, well, as always, we know we need to do display grid, because if we want to use any of the grid properties, then we need to put this on there. And then how would we make it do the same thing as before? Well, we could do something such as grid template columns. And if we wanted to do, if we wanted to make sure each of the 4 elements took up 1 space, we could do something like this. And you can see it creates them all like that. Now, one thing that we had on our last design that we don't have on this one is we don't have the elements appearing kind of, in the middle. So let's do link text line center. If that puts them in the center. Now, there's actually another way we can write this 1FR thing. So, well, there's actually a couple of ways. So if we wanted, let's see if this works. And it does. So if you want to write percentages instead, you can. Or we can actually shorten this. Instead of us having to write 25, 25, 25, 25, or 1FR 4 times, we can actually use one of these newer kind of CSS things called repeat, which is specific for just grid. So you can't just start using this anywhere. And we could do, it takes two values. One is the number of times you want to repeat something. So in our case, it's 4. Then we'll put a comma, and then we could put 1 FR, and it does the same thing. Alternatively, you could put 25% there. And it does that. So, okay, that's cool. So we've made our navigation look okay. So let's move on to the container now. So let's do display grid again. And then we want to create that same layout. So let's do grid template columns. Okay, so if we remember from before, we had width 70 and width 30. Which kind of did the sizing for us. Now, one thing to bear in mind is if we have a look at this code, we've not actually got this anymore. We've not got this width 30, width 70 thing. It's not here because we don't need it. So we could do 2 FR, 1 FR here, and it starts to put those items in a similar fashion. Or alternatively, we could do 70%, 30%, and that's going to be a bit more actually like how we had it. So, oh, actually, I think I've maybe done something slightly different here. Container. Okay, well, either way, it starts to give you some ideas of how you can do it. So this is slightly different, of course, to what we had before, where we had the sidebar on the right-hand side. You can effectively do that, but hopefully this at least just gives you an idea of what you can do with CSS Grid. Now, one thing I wanted to show you as well is there's no reason why you can't use Flex and Grid together. So let's just grab all this code here. And I wanted to just show you a couple of things. So you'll see here that we're actually using Flex for the navigation. And for our container, we're still just using Grid. Like, that's fine. We can still use that. So there's nothing to say you can't just mix it up and use what is appropriate for certain things. So in this case, it might be that using navigation, using display flex is better for the navigation because it automatically centers every item. So I've not had to use this kind of text align center thing that I did in the previous example. One thing I'll just show you as well at the same time is that this column gap here creates this space in between those two columns. Some of you may have seen this before as grid column gap, which will still work, but that's been deprecated now. For anyone who's not aware of what deprecation means with regards to kind of programming, it just means kind of it's not really used anymore. Like, it still exists for now, but it's not kind of the best practice for whatever reason. It's an outdated thing. So you can just use column gap. Just to make this a bit more apparent what's going on, we do 100 pixels and it creates this space here. Sometimes you hear this known as guttering or column guttering. And you can also do it for rows as well, but it's not really going to do much there because we're using columns. But just so you're aware. Okay, so right, okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of the grid and flex bit. Let me just bring this screen back up. And yep, as AI mentions in the chat, you can't have 5 containers with main. Exactly. Yeah, you're only meant to have 1 on there, hence the name main. It's the main one, not the main 5. So, okay. I will just take a sip of water in the meantime. And on the screen, you can see a bunch of different properties that typically get used for when using grid. In the case of the ones where you can see like 25%, 100 pixels auto, that's just an example. That's not what you have to write there. And then many of the flex properties that we didn't really cover, kind of like justify content and things like that, can be used in conjunction with grid. Okay. And then, yeah, as I said, there's no reason why you can't use them together. Okay, so responsive web design. This is a crucial part of CSS. Not many people get this right, even though they feel like they do or think they do. So it's important that we understand some of the fundamentals and understand the significance of it. Right. Okay. So. Yeah, so the use of mobile devices to surf the web has grown substantially over the past decade. Mobile use accounts for approximately half of all web traffic. So the screen dimension or viewport of a phone is very different to that of a laptop or desktop, not just in screen orientation, but also in size, or rather kind of number of pixels or the number of DPI. Because of this, we often require a different approach to how content is laid out on the screen. So when I mention kind of screen orientation, what we're effectively saying here is that, the rotation of the phone, of your phone, not even rotation, but it's effectively this: the screen on your phone is longer than it is wide. Whereas in most cases, the screen on your desktop or laptop is wider than it is long. So it's a completely different orientation. And therefore, the websites you design probably need to look different on both devices, or both sizes, or orientations, I should say. Now, responsive web design was originally defined by a gentleman by the name of Ethan Marcotte. And responsive web design responds to the needs of the user and the device they're using. So the layout changes based on the size and capabilities of the device. For example, on a phone, users would see content shown maybe in a single column. A tablet may show that same content in 2 columns, whereas a desktop may have the content laid out completely differently. There are countless websites where if you look at it on your desktop, it looks completely different to how it does on your phone. Now, there's a multitude of different screen sizes that exist across phones, tablets, phablets, which are basically, those really big phones, desktops, game consoles, TVs, and even wearables. Screen sizes are always changing, so it's important that your site can respond to any screen size today and in the future. In addition, devices have different features. So a traditional computer, for example, is likely going to use a keyboard and mouse for interaction, barring any kind of accessibility issues, of course. Whereas a mobile phone is typically going to use your finger and maybe a touch screen, or maybe a stylus instead of a finger. So it's a completely different mode of interacting with the browser. So there are a few things that we always need to make sure we do in order to ensure that our website is responsive. Now, you may remember this meta tag from a few weeks ago. So we're going to just talk about it again for a moment. Now, pages optimized for a variety of devices must include a meta viewport tag in the head of the document. I've seen quite a few of you using these in your homework, so that's good. That's what you should be doing. So a meta viewport tag gives the browser instructions gives them instructions on how to control the page's dimensions and scaling. So some browsers will keep the page's width constant when rotating to landscape mode, and it might zoom rather than reflow to fill the screen. Whereas adding the value initial scale equals 1 instructs the browser to establish a one-to-one relationship between CSS pixels and device-independent pixels, regardless of device orientation. And it allows the page to take advantage of the full landscape width. So again, just don't worry if this is going over your head. Just use this meta tag that you can see on the screen, the current values that you can see there, and you'll be fine. So nothing to worry about as long as you use that. So I just wanted to go over some tips as well for how we can ensure that the content on our page is responsive. Now, unless you're creating something that specifically requires it, you should never have a horizontal scroll bar on your website. If you do, you've probably designed something wrong. So it's important that we kind of cover some ways to make sure this doesn't happen. For anyone not aware, when we're saying horizontal scroll bar, we mean, going from left to right. Users are used to scrolling vertically, up, top down. They're not used to going left to right. So that shouldn't really be happening. So some ways that we can avoid this, well, images can often be a culprit of horizontal scrolling that wasn't expected. So an image has fixed dimensions, and if it's larger than the viewport, it's going to cause that scroll bar. But a common way to deal with the problem is to just give all images a max width of 100%. So, this will basically just cause the image to shrink to fit the space it has. So should the viewport size be smaller than the actual image dimensions, that's okay if you use maxed width 100%, because it's going to make it shrink down so it never goes beyond the screen size. So it's generally safe as well to just add the following to your style sheet. And then you'll never have that problem with images causing a scroll bar, as long as you've got this on there. Another one is the actual width of the container of your website. So since screen dimensions and width in CSS pixels vary between devices, for example, with phones and tablets, and even just between different phones, and we're talking about things like pixel density, content should not rely on a particular viewport width to render well. So when setting the width of certain elements, you should aim to use % where possible. By using % for the widths, the columns always remain a certain percentage of the container. This means that the columns become narrower rather than creating a scroll bar. So, of course, there are going to be certain instances where you might want to use a fixed pixel width for something, maybe like a certain type of image or something. Bear in mind, we're talking about width, not max width. When you're creating layouts, I would be surprised if there's ever an instance where you need a column to be, say, 500 pixels wide, for example. Rather, you should be using a percentage of 100 to create that column. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, ask me in the Q&A section afterwards and I'll explain a bit more. So we've got some tips there, but the main thing is this media that we've got here with an @ symbol at the beginning. I wonder who has that account on Twitter. I'll have to have a look into that. Anyway, so sometimes you'll need to create more extensive changes to your layout to support a certain screen size than the techniques that we've mentioned so far. And this is where media queries become useful. So if you think beforehand, all we've been talking about is some tips that we should kind of just use all the time in CSS, but we've not actually discussed how we make, say, like a 1-column layout become a 2-column layout on a tablet, or how we take that and make it become a 3-column layout on a desktop. So media queries is just simple filters that can be applied to your CSS styles, and they make it easy to change styles based on the type of device rendering the content or the features of that device. For example, width, height, orientation, ability to hover, whether the device is being used as a touch screen, things like that. So for responsive web design, we're typically querying the features of the device in order to provide a different layout. We're able to create styles that are actually, wait, let me rephrase that. So there are different things or different media queries that you can use. So the most common one is using a media query based on the viewport size, or like the width or the height of the screen. And we're able to create styles that are only active based on viewport size. And examples of things that we can target are things like width, or maybe the minimum width or the maximum width. We can do the same for height. We might target orientation, so whether the user is using their device in landscape or portrait mode. We can even target aspect ratio as well. There are also media queries that you can use based on device capability. So we're able to create styles that are maybe only active based on certain device capabilities. So, for example, whether the user is using a mouse, or maybe whether they're using a finger or a stylus. And examples of things that we can target are hover or pointer. So actually, let's go back to that in a moment. So, well, how do we choose what kind of breakpoints to use when we're creating a website? Now, the key thing is to not be overly specific. So don't start, and just bear in mind that we're talking about, when you start creating a website, how do you know what kind of device widths and heights and sizes to create your website for? Now, you could just all of a sudden start looking on the internet and kind of finding all of the different device sizes for maybe like the new iPhone or the new Samsung or whatever. Ideally, this is not really how you should be. This is not how you should be creating responsive layouts. Rather than kind of researching lots of device sizes, you should aim for targeting just a few kind of broader width sizes. So aim to maybe target 2 to 4 at most. So this will make a bit more sense in a moment as well. So when creating these major breakpoints, in fact, let me just tell you an example. So rather than say targeting 370 pixels wide and 420 pixels wide and 650 pixels wide and 768 pixels wide and 1,000 pixels wide and 1,200 pixels wide, rather than trying to target all of those, just try to target devices. So it could be that, okay, I want to target anything below 420 pixels because that's probably going to be a mobile phone. Anything above 420 but below maybe 800 is probably going to be a tablet. So I might target that. And then anything else is probably going to be a device like a laptop or a desktop. So that's that. And then you can see we've only got like 3 media queries we're trying to go for. Now, so the thing here is just pick major breakpoints. Now, this is something that not many people follow, which is when you pick major breakpoints, you should start small and then work up. Now, the general consensus nowadays is that designers should be taking a mobile-first approach to websites. As mentioned before, half of internet usage is on a mobile device, and that's probably only going to increase more and more as time goes on. This means design the content to fit on a small device first. What you can do is start small and then expand the screen until a breakpoint becomes necessary. For example, maybe you've designed something for a small device, and as you've increased the screen size, the viewport has increased to a point where your content no longer looks good, which means, okay, maybe it's time for another breakpoint. This allows you to optimize breakpoints based on content and maintain the least number of breakpoints possible. Okay, so these are just some examples of different kind of media queries. It's not to say that you should use all of these or any of them, but it just gives you an idea of how to write them. And this is what you would put inside of your CSS file. And then you've got the curly braces, which you'll be used to in CSS. Obviously, instead of those 3 dots, though, that's where you'd actually start to write the your CSS classes for specific targets. So, okay, yeah. So let's imagine that sorry, just one moment. I've lost where I was in my notes. Okay. So as mentioned before as well, let's imagine that we were designing a website using a mobile first approach. So we've made it to make sure it looks good on small devices. And as we begin to increase the width of our screen, we notice that maybe it doesn't look good anymore as the screen goes above 600 pixels wide, that is. So that could be a good time to create a breakpoint. So to insert a breakpoint at 600 pixels, what we would do is create a media query at the end of your CSS file. And then inside of it, we'd put any CSS that we'd want to use when the screen size is above 600 pixels. So we might have something like this, where all of your CSS that you've written so far is just above it. And then any kind of specific things that we want to target for bigger devices, we would put inside of the media query that we've got on the second line. So hopefully that makes some sense. But bear in mind as well, there's nothing to say you can't pick some minor breakpoints when necessary. So in addition to choosing those major breakpoints when layout changes significantly, it's also helpful to adjust for minor changes. So it might be that you've got some minor changes that you need to do for things like margins and padding of a specific element. Or maybe you want to adjust the font size of your header to make it feel a bit more natural as the layouts increase or decrease in size. So it's okay to target a few things, but you shouldn't be trying to target everything. Okay, Devesh, got confused between min width and max width. So actually, no, I can cover that now. So with min width and max width, we're saying, okay, on the second line, we're saying, okay, if the width of the screen is at least 601 pixels, then whatever is inside of those media queries, I want that to happen. So that might be everything you want to happen on a desktop. The opposite would be max width, where you're saying, okay, anything below 601 pixels, I want you to use these styles. One thing I just want to stress as well is that your media queries should be below your original styles. So in our case, when we say we're doing this mobile first approach, the CSS we've written so far was designed for a mobile phone. You then do your media queries below all of that code. And the reason why is because if you do it the other way around, then there's a chance that whatever you've written below is going to just overrule and kind of overwrite whatever you've done before. Again, because of cascading style sheets, where the very last line of CSS will always run, if that makes sense. So long story short, just if you are using media queries, make sure you use them after any kind of initial declarations you've made. So a couple other things I just wanted to mention as well before we get to that summary. Optimize text for reading. Okay, so when you're doing these when you're making these columns and layouts and things like that, and you've got bodies of text, something to bear in mind is that classic readability theory suggests that an ideal column should contain no more than 70 to 80 characters per line, which is about 8 to 10 words in English, at least anyway. So each time, if you've got a block of text and you're increasing the width of your screen, if you're getting to a point where you've just got a lot of words on one line, that probably is an indicator that you need a breakpoint to do something, to kind of put some padding or whatever on there. If you look at any kind of blogging website, like proper blogging websites, you'll notice that the lines of text really go over maybe like 10 or 11 words, and that's because of readability theory, where it's the idea that it's easier to read something when there are fewer words per line. And finally, when you are using these responsive or media queries, don't, for smaller devices, don't just hide information that you would otherwise have on a desktop without good reason. So the bad reason is you're just hiding content because it can't fit on the screen. And by hiding content, I mean using something like display none or display hidden. Don't just do that because it makes your design look better on a mobile device, because you may very well be hiding information that a user actually wants. So just to summarize, there are many ways to create layouts in CSS. Tables, or the table element, should only be used when creating actual tables. Flex and grid are generally what people use in 2021. I put 2021 instead of today because, for all we know, a few years from now, there could be something better that arrives. So I just want to highlight that this is what people use in 2021. If you really want to become a good software developer, a web developer, designer, you have to know and appreciate that CSS continues to evolve. As we've seen with the different, tables, floats, flex, and grid over the past 20 years, 25 years, things change and evolve and adapt, and you have to be willing to continue to learn. Anyway, so you can use flex and grid in conjunction. Flex enables one-dimensional layout design. Grid enables two-dimensional layout design. Responsive design is critical to the success of your website. Around half of all web browsing takes place on mobile devices. Mobile-first design is considered a best practice. Designing for mobile should be part of your design process and not an afterthought. Media queries enable responsive design. It is possible to target device types, screen sizes, device capabilities, plus a lot more with media, and write your media queries below the original CSS styling. Okay. Right, everybody. I hope that has been useful. And there was a lot we covered a lot, and we also missed out a few things just purely for brevity and to make sure it doesn't become too overwhelming. So there is some additional further reading that I would recommend as well. I'm going to attach some links into the Discord chat in a little while. Yeah, so I hope that's been useful. Right, let me just stop the recording.